"No, George, you can't go fishing. You need to do your chores," George's mother told him. He had wanted to go fishing the whole day, but his chores had piled up. He decided to just leave since he was in a bad mood. He slammed the door shut and left, holding his fishing rod and reel in his hand. He walked to the lake. It was quiet and he fished. The water was still and he had no bites for hours. He felt incredibly frustrated and slammed his rod to the ground, leaving the area. A couple of men saw him do this and stopped him before he left the lake. "Hey, aren't you Andrew's kid?" one of them spoke up. He was an old grizzled man that held a fishing rod and a cup of coffee in the other hand. "Yeah, why?" George grumbled, continuing to leave. "You won't catch with that rod and reel. Take this one," the man shouted behind him, throwing him a shiny brand new rod. The rod was sturdy and completely brand new. "Why would you give me this?" George asked, startled at the sudden gift. "Consider it a gift for being Arthur's grandson," the old man replied. George was surprised and walked home, his new rod in hand and a confident swagger. He opened the door and his mother immediately shouted at him, berating him for his lack of responsibility. George didn't care, and he finished his chores. He went up to his room, examining every part of the new rod. He was astonished and looked at his wall, where a collage of fishing magazines were hung up. It was all fishing competitions that had been won by his grandfather, Arthur. "I wish I could be like him," George whispered to himself. His late grandfather smiled in all of the pictures. The man he met at the lake had revered his grandfather so much as to give George a free rod and reel. He kept looking at the rod and thought to himself, pondering long and hard, why wasn't he a good fisherman? Why didn't he have any talent? Then his dad walked in. "Your mother told me what you did today." "Wait a minute. Is that a new rod?" "Yeah. Why do you care?" George snapped back. "Son, I'm not mad at you. Just tell me where you got that," Andrew spoke, his tone calm. He stepped towards George, taking the rod and reel, inspecting it. "This is real nice, son," Andrew said, handing the rod back. He looked at the wall and the magazines lining it. "Why don't you try to win one of those?" Andrews asked, pointing at the collage. "I'm no good at fishing," George said, standing up to put the rod away. "No, you can do it. Just believe in yourself," Andrew sighed. "That'll only get me so far. I have no talent at all," George grumbled. "Why don't we go together?" Andrew asked. George was startled. His dad had never been fishing since his grandfather passed. "But," George stuttered. "No, son, we're going fishing. Get your stuff ready and we'll head out tomorrow," Andrew ordered. George readied his things and couldn't sleep because of the excitement for the next day. They woke up early, drank their coffee, ate breakfast, and headed out. The day was calling them, and they went straight to the lake to register for the competition. "Hey there, Andrew," a man called out to them. He was in full fishing gear and looked like a stereotypical fisherman. His equipment was in the back of his pickup truck and was full of lures, different reels, a few rods, as well as a few extra things George knew nothing about. "Hi, Jeremy. How you been?" Andrew replied, motioning to George to go register for them. As they talked, George went to the booth to register. He was told to rent a small boat and paid the fees. Everything was ready, and he walked back to his dad with their documents. "Dad, let's go," George said, handing over the papers. The competition was starting soon, and the rules were being read out by the judges. They all stood near the dock and listened. The rules are as follows. Each team will consist of 2 anglers. You're allowed to fish from the shore or the lake. The winner will have to bring the heaviest walleye. All fish must be caught without any foul play. May the best fisherman win, and everybody be back by 5 p.m. sharp, the judge announced. They each hurriedly grabbed their equipment, some going to the outskirts of the lake to fish from the shore, and others jumping into their boats. George and Andrew took it slow and planned as they went. "Son, we're going to win this, all right? Just follow my lead," Andrew said, climbing into the boat. They started it and set out, gently cruising on the serene blue waters. They passed by fishermen who had already begun catching fish, huge walleye, and George looked nervous. "Relax, kid. It's only the start," Andrew said, noticing George's concern. They finally reached the back of the lake where there was a shady area to fish. "This is perfect," Andrew said. "Pull out your fishing rod," he added. The two began fishing, but to no avail. Nothing was biting, and the water was still. After a few hours of this, George slammed his rod to the floor. It bounced up and slapped George in the face. "That's what you get for being impatient," Andrew joked. George wasn't having it and sat back down. "Fish won't always bite, kid. You need to be patient, and it'll pay off," Andrew advised. He watched his rod and sipped a cold drink. The rod moved, and immediately he grabbed it, waiting for the fish to bite. He then set the hook perfectly. A few moments later, the fish lay in the boat, and George was shocked. He looked at it and smiled, grabbing his rod. He started fishing again, and the fish came in one after another. Their luck had changed for the better, but would it be enough to win the competition? They would just have to find out. They kept fishing well after lunch, and the time was nearly over. So they headed back to grab a quick bite to eat and check out the other catches. They pulled up to the shore, docking the boat, and took their fish to the weighing table. Their cooler was marked, and they were allowed to sit back. They watched as other fishermen walked through, and George spotted a huge fish. He pointed towards it, and Andrew's jaw dropped. It had to have been the largest walleye he had ever seen. It had to have been over 10 pounds, and the fish they had caught couldn't compare. Andrew sighed. "Looks like we got beaten," he said softly. "Let's go back. We have to win for Grandpa," George replied, frustrated. "No, let's just wait. There's only 20 minutes left either way," Andrew said. But George had already left. He ran and disappeared into the greenery, his rod in hand. "That kid will be the death of me," Andrew grumbled. "Ha! The kid's got fire," a voice came from behind. It was an old friend. "I met him yesterday, gave him that rod and reel, and I see he's putting it to good use," the man laughed. "Long time no see, Sam," George replied. "I had a feeling it was you who gave it to him," George laughed. "Time flies, man. Kid's all grown up. Let me see if he can turn the tides and catch a decent one," Sam sighed. They both continued talking, and most of the fishermen walked through, each carrying a cooler, and they all marked theirs, placing them on the long table. The weigh-ins were starting, and the judges began. There were still 10 minutes until the time was over, and they began weighing each fish. After everything was weighed, the largest was a 14-pounder, and everyone was shocked. The runners-up were off by a pound, and were disgruntled, but congratulated the lucky fisherman. There was 1 minute left, and Andrew grew worried. He began pacing backwards and forwards, waiting on George. Then he heard a yell. George was running like his life depended on it. He beelined towards them in a huff. He held up the fish he had caught, and it was huge and looked nearly identical to the winner. He laid it on the table and looked proud. "Wow, George, I didn't know you had it in you. Let's see how much it comes out to," Andrew said, smiling. "The time is over. Weigh-ins are done," the judge said, handing the fish back to George, who looked upset. He turned his back and walked away. "Hey!" a shout came from the crowd. "Let the kid weigh his fish. It was only a minute late," the crowd shouted. The judge looked at the winner, who laughed heartily. "Let the kid weigh his fish. If he wins, he deserves it," the man said. The fish was weighed, and it came out to 14.1 pounds, 1/10 of a pound heavier than the previous best. The crowd cheered. George had won his first competition. Andrew smiled. "That's my son," he shouted, pumping the air. George was given a huge trophy along with a decent cash prize. He went home happy as can be and hung up his own picture next to his grandfather's. He had finally won something, and from then on, he went on to win competition after competition and cemented himself as the boy who fished.